In a medieval world where names were few and justice was blunt, being called John the Baker could be enough to get you hanged, not for anything you did, but simply because your name was common. In 14th century England, surnames were not fixed. People were identified by their occupation, hometown, or parentage. You were Thomas of York, Alice the Weaver, or John son of Robert. But if there were 5 Johns in your village, each baking bread, you were all just John the Baker. And when someone committed a crime, that was enough to condemn you. Court records from the 1300s are littered with vague, chilling entries. John the Baker, arrested for theft. Alice of the Well accused of harboring rebels. William the Carter fined for poaching. But which John? Which Alice? There were no fingerprints, no photos, no formal identification beyond a name and a vague description. And if someone reported John the Baker stole a horse, any John baking bread within 20 miles could be arrested. This wasn't rare, it was common. A recorded case from 1362 in Suffolk tells of a man named John the Smith, who was seized and jailed for nearly a month for a murder he didn't commit. The real killer, also named John, also a Smith, but from another town. The victim's family swore vengeance. The reeve didn't want to risk disobedience, so the first John they found was thrown in chains. He was lucky. He was eventually cleared. Others weren't. In 1381, during the chaos of the peasants' revolt, and Adam the Carter was accused of leading rebels into a manor house, meant setting fire to its stores and killing the steward. Records show he was dragged from his cottage and executed within 2 days. But later testimony revealed something horrifying. The real Adam, the one responsible, had already fled. The wrong Adam died, simply because the name matched. This wasn't limited to the city, to the countryside. In London, where thousands crowded into districts with only a handful of repeated names, the problem multiplied. Dozens of Marjories, Alices, Johns, and Thomases shared identical occupations. And when a summons was issued for Geoffrey the Tanner, no one checked twice. You were either the right man or someone who looked close enough, and once accused, defending yourself was nearly impossible. You couldn't prove your identity. You couldn't show papers or dates. You were who they said you were, until the rope tightened or the door closed behind you. That's the horror of it, the randomness. In a world where records were inconsistent and guilt traveled faster than evidence, your name could be your noose. Some families, desperate to avoid suspicion, started naming children after obscure saints or using longer identifiers like Hugh the Short-Faced or Elena by the Marsh in hopes of escaping confusion, but the law rarely cared for nuance. When crimes were punished swiftly to preserve order, mistakes were not corrected, they were buried, and so the people adapted in silence. If your name was called in the square, you didn't answer right away. You looked to see who else turned first. You watched for signs. You stayed quiet. You made your own name forgettable or invisible, because anonymity wasn't just protection, it was survival. We often think of medieval injustice in terms of torture, feudal abuse, or public executions, but this was something colder, something terrifying in its banality, a system that could end your life, not because you did anything wrong, but because you shared a name with someone who did. That's not justice. That's a lottery with death at the end. Today, we carry surnames, Idaho cards, biometric scans, but in that world, your entire identity could collapse under a single accusation, and your only defense was hope. Hope that someone else's crime didn't bear your name. Hope that when the record said John, they didn't mean you. Hope that history would forget the lie before it took your life, because many didn't get that chance. And their stories, the innocent Johns, the wrong Marjories, the mistaken Alices, are mostly gone. But their silence remains, a reminder that even a name can be dangerous, and sometimes the simplest identity can become your greatest curse. You had no legal identity in many courts, in the cold, echoing chambers of medieval courts, where justice wore the robes of nobility and the voice of the law spoke in Latin. There was a rule not always written, but always enforced. If you had no name, you had no voice. This was the brutal truth for thousands across medieval Europe. If you were poor, landless, nameless in the legal sense, your word simply didn't count. You could be present, you could be harmed, you could even be innocent, but without a formal, documented identity tied to land, guild, or blood, your testimony could be dismissed as unreliable. Not because of what you said, but because of who you weren't. Medieval courts were never neutral arenas of truth-seeking. They were built upon hierarchies, social, economic, and feudal. Nobles had surnames, coats of arms, and land charters. Monks had order names and an ecclesiastical backing. Merchants had guild registrations, seals, and witnesses. But a field worker, a shepherd, a washerwoman, their names were often just first names, common, forgettable, unrecorded, and sometimes not even that. Imagine this. A woman named Ellen is assaulted in her village. She knows the attacker. She tells the steward. She weeps at the Lord's hall. She gives her story in trembling detail, but the court clerk, stylus poised above the parchment, asks, "Full name?" She gives what she has. Ellen, daughter of no one known to the court, wife of a man who owns no land. The clerk sighs. He writes nothing. To the scribe, to the judge, to the system, Ellen may as well not exist. Because in many medieval legal systems, especially in England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, testimony required status, and status meant documentation. You needed to be known, registered, or vouched for. Names tied to property were everything. It's why people were called John of Norwich or Henry, son of Walter. The identity was geographic, feudal, legal. If you couldn't anchor yourself in one of those ways, your words floated off into nothing. This wasn't just a bias. It was embedded in the very structure of law. Landowners could testify in land disputes. Guild members could speak in trade cases. Clerics had rights of audience. But peasants, especially itinerant ones, had to rely on character witnesses, patron intercession, or miraculous luck to even be heard. In many cases, their testimony was only allowed if a known man, a legal person, stood beside them and swore to their honesty. Without that, even the truth could die at the door. Court records from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with phrases like, "Her word is not taken," or "He lacks proper name," or simply, "No standing to speak." One English bailiff, writing in 1310, noted that a dispute involving two peasant men over stolen livestock was resolved without hearing, because neither could name father, lord, or land. In other words, they had no legal selves, and this went beyond the courtroom. It infected every corner of life. If you wanted to file a grievance, to register a complaint, to even marry legally, or have your child baptized with full rights, you needed a name that fit the system's idea of identity. Otherwise, you existed in a kind of legal fog, visible but unrecognized, living but voiceless. Some people tried to cheat the system. They adopted fake surnames, claimed land they didn't own, or begged a local lord to grant them naming rights. A few succeeded. Most were caught and punished, ironically, for claiming identities they were denied from birth. The irony is staggering. The same system that refused to acknowledge you because you were nameless would then punish you for trying to give yourself a name. One infamous case from 1344 tells of a man called simply Tom the Swineherd in a small English hamlet. After witnessing a brutal murder, he came forward to testify. He had seen everything, knew the killer, even knew the weapon used, but because he had no surname, no property, and no affiliation with the church or any guild, his testimony was deemed insufficient. When he returned again, this time calling himself Thomas of Highmore, the steward investigated and discovered he had simply made up the location. The penalty? Public flogging for false representation. The murder case? Dismissed. No credible witnesses remained. This wasn't unique. Women, too, were affected, often even more severely. Their names were tied to husbands or fathers. A widow might be called Agnes, relict of William. A servant girl might not be recorded at all, and if they tried to speak in court without a male relative or employer to validate them, they were considered gossiping, hysterical, or worse, liars. Even crimes against the poor were shaped by this structure. If a noble wronged a peasant, the peasant's inability to testify often meant the case never moved forward. If a servant was abused, their word might not stand against their masters. In many rape trials of the time, women without the noble ties were outright denied a hearing. The law, quite literally, listened to the landed. But perhaps the most tragic element of all was the silence this system created. Generations of people passed through life unseen by the legal world. They paid rents, they bore children, they worked fields, they died, and their stories vanished because no court would listen. Their names, if they were ever spoken, disappeared in the wind, and yet they lived, they mattered. Today, as we look back through brittle court rolls and fading parchments, we can see the shape of their absence. The cases where no witness was called, the verdicts based on insufficient standing. The people erased not by fire or flood, but by paperwork. So, what does this tell us? That legal systems are not just about right or wrong, they're about recognition. And in medieval Europe, the greatest injustice wasn't always what the court did, but who it refused to see. A name was a door. Without one, you were left outside. Tax collectors invented fake surnames to track and trap you. In the 14th century, your name wasn't just who you were. It was who someone said you were, especially if that someone carried the king's seal and a parchment scroll, especially if they were a tax collector, because across England, in villages, you'll never see on a map, ordinary men, poor men, nameless men were being labeled, literally, not out of respect, but to be tracked, counted, charged, because names, real or invented, turned peasants into targets. The year was 1377, the beginning of a new tax system called the poll tax, a head tax. Every person over a certain age had to pay. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, working or dying. If your name appeared on the list, you owed. But most poor laborers didn't have last names. Not formally. They were just called John, or William, or Alice. That's all anyone ever needed. Until now. Because the taxman couldn't charge John, there were too many Johns, too many Thomases, too many Agneses and Ediths. So they invented surnames on the spot. Tax records from that era are filled with them. You can still read them today. John Atwell, because he lived near the village well. Thomas Shepherdson, even if he never owned a sheep. Alice Underhill, because her cottage was at the base of a hill. Edwin Withnail, likely because he was missing one. These weren't family names. They weren't legacies. They were trackers. Once assigned, That name stuck. You'd show up on the next tax scroll and the next, even if you moved, even if you married, even if you died. Your children inherited the invented surname, and with it, the tax history tied to it. You became a ledger line, and your name became a chain. This wasn't about knowing people. It was about knowing who to bleed. The tax collectors didn't ask if you had coin. They asked if your name was on the scroll, and when you couldn't pay, they'd take what you had: tools, livestock, grain. In some places, they'd take your child to work it off, and if you fled, that name would follow you. It didn't matter if it wasn't real. It was real to the law, and the worst part, many of these fake names were humiliating. They were descriptions, accusations, mockery, etched into record. Roger Clopate, Henry Coward, Mabel Drinkley. What began as administration became humiliation. Because when power labels you, it doesn't ask if it's fair, it asks if it's convenient. And for a century, English villages were filled with people trapped inside names they never chose. Names that didn't honor their lineage, but advertised their poverty, their profession, or their location like a brand. Some of these invented surnames survived. They were passed down. Today, there are people named Underwood, Hill, Thatcher, or Baker, never knowing the moment that word was stamped on an ancestor's head by a clerk who couldn't be bothered to ask their true story. Also, they could be taxed, tracked, owned by the page. This wasn't a rare tactic. It was systemic. By 1381, resentment exploded into the Peasants' Revolt, one of the first mass uprisings in English history. And what were they burning? Tax records, name scrolls, ledgers of invented identities. Because the people weren't just fighting for their land, they were fighting to reclaim their names. But it was too late. The damage was done, because when a name is written in ink by someone more powerful than you, it becomes law, even if it was born from laziness, mockery, or greed. And centuries later, the echoes remain, because a name, once forced upon you, doesn't just sit on the page. It wraps around your life like a collar. And in 14th century England, that collar meant you paid, or you disappeared. You couldn't marry without proving you were the right Thomas. In the tightly woven social fabric of a medieval village, identity was not just personal, it was contractual. And in a world without last names for most people, where half the men might be named Thomas and half the women Alice, confusion wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. But when it came to marriage, that confusion could be catastrophic. Imagine this. A young woman named Alice, daughter of a modest blacksmith, has been betrothed by her father to a man named Thomas, a Thatcher's son from the next hamlet. A marriage contract is drawn up. It's informal, but sacred. Witnessed by neighbors, sealed with handshakes, a kiss, and sometimes a token or a coin. Days later, the priest begins recording the banns, the public announcement of the intended union. 3 Sundays in a row, he reads aloud, "Thomas is to wed Alice." But which Thomas? That question, simple on the surface, could unravel lives. Because in many medieval parishes, surnames as we know them today didn't yet exist or weren't consistently used. People were known by first names and maybe a descriptor. Thomas the Miller, Thomas of Ashwood, Thomas, Geoffrey's son. Sometimes those descriptors changed depending on where someone moved or who they were standing next to in that moment. Records, if kept at all, were handwritten, prone to error, and based on memory as much as fact. And so, one Thomas could be confused for another. A marriage contract made for Thomas the carpenter might be carried out by Thomas the baker. A dowry offered to one might be claimed by another. A bride expecting one face at the altar might find herself bound in the eyes of church and law to a stranger. This wasn't just awkward, it was legally binding. Marriage in the medieval world wasn't purely romantic, it was economic, political, and sacred. Contracts were made between families, not just individuals. Land, livestock, and reputation were often at stake, and once the church officiated a marriage, even if the wrong Thomas stood there, it could not be undone easily. Divorce was not an option. Annulments required bishops, coin, and scandal, so once a mistake was made, it often had to be lived with. To avoid disaster, entire systems of informal verification developed. Villagers would specify not just names, but family lines, occupations, and even physical traits. Thomas, son of John, with a crooked hand. Alice, who spins by the east gate. Matchmakers and clergy alike became experts at sorting through these identities. Priests would ask probing questions before recording marriage banns. Parents might interrogate the groom to confirm lineage and trade. In towns with written records, scribes would add Latin descriptors, Thomas Filius Roberti, to distinguish each man from his many namesakes. Yet, despite every precaution, mistakes happened. In one documented case from 14th century Norfolk, a woman named Alice was mistakenly married to the wrong Thomas after a band's reader confused two families of similar names. The mistake wasn't discovered until after the ceremony. The dowry sheep had already been delivered. The wrong Thomas reportedly refused to annul the marriage because Alice's family was wealthier than the one he had originally courted. The church ruled in his favor. The original suitor lost his bride and his sheep, but not all outcomes were so calculating. In some cases, innocent couples who'd grown up with the same names, their whole lives were separated by the church's fear of fraud. There are records of young lovers who were forced to swear elaborate oaths to prove their identities, naming their parents, grandparents, and even the midwives who delivered them to get married. And in smaller communities, it became common for families to add unofficial surnames to their kin, not legal surnames, but identifying tags. These would later evolve into the last names we recognize today: Thomas Thatcher, Alice Weaver, Thomas Ashwood, Alice of the Crossroads. These name stabilizers weren't just conveniences. They were born out of necessity to prevent the chaos of mistaken identity, lost dowries, and broken contracts. Because in the end, marriage wasn't just about love, it was about clarity. Who you were had to be known, documented, witnessed. Because if you couldn't prove you were the right Thomas, you might lose everything, not just a bride, but a future. In a time before birth certificates, surnames, and central records, your name was a fragile thing, and in the most important transaction of your life, marriage, you had only your memory, your community's word, and the priest's ink to prove you were the one they meant, and if they got it wrong, there was no going back. People added embarrassing nicknames just to be recognized. You didn't choose your name, not in the medieval world. You were given it by a priest, a parent, or a stranger, and if it didn't set you apart, someone else added something that would. It might have been your teeth, or your smell, or the way you walked with a limp, and once it stuck, it never left. John Smallbones, Emma No Tooth, Roger Clubfoot, Alice Sourbreath. These weren't jokes, they were real names, found in tax rolls, church registries, and marriage records. Not insults whispered behind backs, but legal, recorded identities. Why? Because there were too many Johns, too many Alices, too many Williams and Thomases and Anns. In a village of 50 people, you might find 6 men named John. You had to stand out, And if you didn't do it yourself, someone else would do it for you. And they had used what was visible, what was shameful, what made you easy to remember. Your body became your name. If you were short and thin, John Small Bones. If your teeth were rotting, Emma No Tooth. If your skin was pockmarked, William Blotchface. If you were known for gossip, Agnes Telltale. The local scribe didn't ask for your opinion. The priest didn't soften it. They just wrote it down, ink to parchment, and that name would follow you, to court, to confession, to your grave. Some tried to change it, move the villages, married into new names, but the old ones always resurfaced, especially in legal matters, land ownership, inheritance, debts. If the bailiff came looking for you, he didn't ask for John the Miller. He asked for John Baldhead. It got worse with time. These names passed to your children. If you were known as Henry Pigbelly, your son might become Thomas Pigbelly, even if he never touched a trough in his life. Shame became lineage. The insult became blood. And in many cases, there was no malice, just survival. The system needed to identify people fast, efficiently. Most peasants had no surnames, so names were built out of whatever made you different. Your job, your size, your flaw, your worst day. Imagine being known your whole life for the thing that made people laugh, the thing you tried to hide. Every document you signed, you had to write it. Every marriage ban, every baptismal record, every toll register, you had to say it aloud. I'm Alice No Tooth. Even if you'd gotten new teeth, even if you'd aged, changed, grown, it didn't matter. The name stuck harder than the skin it described, and the damage ran deeper. Some mocked it, others internalized it. Children inherited not just the label, but the shame. Teachers in abbey schools referred to them by it. Nobles used it to assert dominance. Juries called it in courtrooms. There was no escape. In rare cases, people fought back. A few scribes note men who refused the label, insisting on a saint's name or paying priests to bless a new identity. But most couldn't afford that. They bore it until death. Some names, though, transformed. In time, Redhead became a respected surname. Short became just another word. But others, like Hogsblood, Boarface, or Fettock, disappeared. Too humiliating, too raw, lost to fire, flood, or quiet shame. Still, they lived in the margins, in the corners of textbooks, in marriage entries where one line makes you flinch. Wedded, Joan Goatfoot, daughter of Adam Loudbelch. And you realize they were real people, not jokes. They lived under these names, ate, worked, loved, prayed, all while carrying a label that reduced them to a flaw, a moment, a rumor, not because they wanted it, but because the world needed them to be easy to find. That's the part that cuts deepest. They weren't trying to be memorable. They were just trying to exist. But existence wasn't enough in a world ruled by hierarchy and record-keeping. To matter, you had to be named. And to be named meant being exposed. And so, John Smallbones was remembered, while John the Kind, or John the Quiet, or John who helped his neighbors vanished in dust. That is the tragedy of medieval names. Not that they were cruel, but that they erased the truth of who someone really was. And in some ways, we still do it. We label, we reduce. We remember people by their worst moment, their body, their flaw, their loudest failure, and we carry those names like weights, even now. So when you hear Emma No Tooth, try to remember. She might have once been Emma the Brave, but history never wrote that part down. You were often tied to your worst trait or job forever. In the medieval world, you didn't need a reputation. You were given one. and once it stuck, it never let go. Without inherited surnames, people were named after what they did or what they were, not in quiet conversation, but in public record, in town rolls, in the church ledger, in the mouths of strangers. Mark the drunk, Edgar the coward, Alice the bastard, Marjorie no teeth. These weren't insults whispered in the dark. These were names, legal, spoken, written names. The labels you live with, were married under, were buried by. Your worst moment, your weakest trait, etched into your identity like a brand. And the worst part, you could never change it, because medieval society needed quick labels. Most people lived their whole lives within a few miles of where they were born. Everyone knew everyone. So you were reduced to one thing, your job, your habit, your shame. And that one thing became who you were. Permanently. A boy who stuttered once in front of a priest might become John the Mumbler. A man who froze in battle, whether out of fear or confusion, might be branded Thomas the Coward. A woman born out of wedlock, Agnes the Bastard. She'd carried that name until death, and when the records were passed down, those names stayed. No redemption arc, no privacy, no path to reclaim your dignity. Even professions could turn to prisons. A skilled butcher became Baldwin the Bloody. A grave digger might be called Hugh of the Cold Hands. A failed apprentice who burned bread once, Peter the Scorcher. And even if they changed, learned, improved, it didn't matter. The name stuck, because identity wasn't just personal, it was communal. Your label told others how to treat you, how to speak to you, how to dismiss you. If you were Emma the Fool, your word meant less. If you were Simon the Silent, your opinions were ignored, and so people began to live down to their names. Why fight it if the village had already decided who you were? Why speak up if every reply was met with a smirk and a mutter of your title? Some tried to leave, flee to another town, start fresh, but travel was rare. Suspicion followed strangers, and even if you introduced yourself as just Mark, someone would ask, "Mark who?" And you'd freeze, because the only name you knew was the one they gave you. And if you lied, it was considered fraud. One man in 1310 tried to marry under a different name, changing Gerard the Swindler to Gerard of Oak Street. When the deception was discovered, the marriage was annulled and he was fined. The court ruled, "He hath no right to name above that which is known." Known, not earned. Even noble families sometimes bore the weight of strange inherited nicknames. One record speaks of a minor knight named Elias the Mule. Likely for his stubbornness, his son, though respected and honorable, was still called Thomas, son of the Mule. It never left them. And for the poorest, those without land, rank, or trade, there was nothing to soften the blow. Their nickname was their identity. Your shame became your signature. Your mistake became your monument. This wasn't a world of second chances. It was a world where words carved deeper than wounds. Today, we think of names as flexible. We shorten them, change them, choose them. Back then, names chose you, and they chose what others saw. You could be kind, brave, generous, but if you slipped once, drank too much, ran from a fight, cried in the wrong moment, that became your truth. Not because it was fair, but because it was easy to remember. We tell ourselves that history is about kings and battles, but the deeper history, the painful one, is about the forgotten, the ones buried beneath labels they never asked for. Mark the drunk may have sobered. Edgar the coward may have led in silence. Alice the bastard may have raised 5 children in dignity, but their stories were rewritten by a single cruel title, and we must remember that, because the echo of that world is not gone. Every time we reduce someone to a rumor, every time we flatten a life into a punchline, every time we say, "Oh, that's just who they are," we return to that village, we point, we name, we forget that behind every label there is always more. If you change towns, you became a stranger with no past. In the medieval world, to move was to vanish, and to vanish was to become dangerous. There were no passports, no official ID cards, no national databases to follow you from town to town. What followed you, instead, was silence. If you walked away from your village, left your fields, your lord, your name behind, and arrived somewhere new, you were not a traveler, you were a stranger. And in medieval Europe, a stranger had no past, no trust, and often no future. This wasn't about xenophobia, it was about survival, because in the tightly wound social fabric of medieval life, everyone had a place, and every place had its people. Villages were like living maps of obligation. Who farmed which strip, who owed what rent, who tithed to which priest, who answered to which lord. Your name wasn't just a label, it was a legal node in a web of relationships. Thomas of Breclow wasn't just a man named Thomas. He was Thomas from Breclow, the village where he was born, where he worked, where his family was known, where he was accountable. So if a man named simply, not Thomas, arrived at the edge of another village with no surname, no goods, no documentation, and no story that could be verified, he wasn't seen as neutral. He was a threat. Suspicion came first, then interrogation. Where had he come from? Why had he left? Was he a runaway serf? A thief? A bandit hiding from justice? Or worse, a carrier of plague, a heretic, a spy from a rival estate? Without lineage or record, he could be anyone. And in a world where theft, betrayal, and contagion could destroy an entire community, that unknown was too large a risk. The law reflected this fear. Across 13th and 14th century England, France, and much of continental Europe, village bailiffs and reeves had legal authority to turn away newcomers. In many towns, especially after the famines of the early 1300s and the devastation of the Black Death, in 1347, local laws were passed that allowed for the immediate removal or even punishment of any person who could not name their place of origin or produce a recognized witness to vouch for their character. Imagine this: you're a young man who fled your old village after a famine, or after your lord raised your rent beyond what you could pay. You walk for days, sleeping in barns and under hedges, until you find a new village. The people here have land, they have food, they have work. You offer your hands, your skill. You say only that your name is John. The steward stares. He asks, "John of where?" You hesitate, and in that moment, everything collapses. To be of nowhere was to be no one, and often the outcome was brutal. You could be seized, detained, even whipped. In some towns, strangers were held for days, while messengers were sent to track their past. If no confirmation came, they were either cast out or forced into labor as a form of probation. Some were marked with signs, tatters of red cloth, or tokens pinned to their tunic to show that they were under watch. Others disappeared into the jails and were never recorded again. Women fared no better. A lone woman arriving in a new village was often assumed to be a runaway servant, a beggar, or a prostitute. Unless she could prove her kinship to someone local or had a child to anchor her identity, she was a target for suspicion and exploitation. There are quiet, grim accounts of women being forced to marry laborers or assigned to monastic laundries for their own good. Even if someone did manage to stay, they were often pushed to the margins, both socially and physically. They lived on the village outskirts, They worked the worst jobs. They were excluded from feast days, from guilds, from baptisms and burial rites. Their children might be born without formal recognition, their marriages unrecorded, their deaths unnoticed, and yet, despite all this, people still moved, because staying could be worse. Many who fled did so out of necessity. Their lords were cruel, their fields were barren, their homes were burned in war, or swallowed by plague. And so they walked. They risked suspicion, exile, even death, because what lay behind was worse than what lay ahead. Some found shelter with the church. Monasteries occasionally took in wanderers, offering them charity, sometimes anonymity. Certain towns, especially those near ports or trading roads, became more lenient, especially during times of labor shortage, such as after the Black Death. There, strangers could slowly become locals, but only if they paid taxes, proved use, and waited. 7 years was a common probationary period. 7 years of silence, service, and scrutiny before the village might finally allow you to belong. Still, even then, you would never be truly from there. Because in the medieval mind, identity was rooted in land and lineage. A man belonged to soil, a woman belonged to family. Anything else was ghost-like, a body without a place, a voice without history. So much of medieval survival depended not just on having food or shelter, but on being known. Your name, your origin, your bonds. Without these, the law could not protect you, the church could not record you, the community could not trust you. You were invisible in a world built entirely on memory. And what is most haunting about this system is not just its cruelty, but its permanence. For the unnamed, the undocumented, the strangers who moved from village to village in search of dignity, their stories are gone. They appear only in fragments, a court record dismissing their testimony, a burial listed without a surname, a fine imposed for wandering. No tombstone, no legacy, just echoes in the margins of parchment. So next time we speak of freedom, freedom of movement, of starting over, of being who you choose, remember that for most of history, to move was to risk erasure. In the medieval world, if you changed towns, you didn't just change homes, you lost your past, and the world made sure you knew it. Nobles could claim you had no lineage and seize your inheritance. In the medieval world, bloodline was everything. It determined what you owned, where you lived, who you could marry, and what you could defend. It was your passport, your shield, your only proof of existence in a world run by ink, oath, and steel. But what if your name wasn't written anywhere? What if no one remembered your father's father? What if your family had worked the land for 3 generations, but the land itself was claimed by someone with a title, a seal, and the ear of the crown? Then you were rootless, and rootless meant powerless. Across England and much of Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, peasants often lived without formal surnames, without land deeds, without legal contracts. They were known by first names, locations, trades. John the Miller, Alice of the Meadow, Thomas by the Brook. These were community names, spoken names, human names. But they weren't legal names, not to the court, not to the nobility. And when a dispute arose over a plot of land, a stretch of pasture, or a few dozen cattle, the burden of proof always fell on the poor. If a noble laid claim to your field, all he had to do was question your lineage, ask who your grandfather was, demand a written document showing you were the heir, and when you couldn't produce one, he could turn to the court and say, "There is no rightful heir. The man is rootless. The land reverts to me." And the court would agree, not because it was just, but because it was simple. Legal lineage was currency, and without it, you were no one. A ghost in the eyes of the law, a body working the land that no longer belonged to you, and the land could be seized, the cattle sold, the home razed, the family scattered, all because someone with power declared you didn't exist on parchment. This wasn't a rare injustice. It was a tactic, a calculated weapon of silence. In Wiltshire, a family lost a full acre of farmland in 1382 after a Baron Stewart successfully argued the son had no provable parentage, never mind that his father had died harvesting that land, or that 3 generations were buried under it. There were no records, no seal, just stories passed down, and stories didn't count. In Yorkshire, in 1404, an entire hamlet was cleared after a noble claimed the peasants had no known line. The court wrote them off as transients, despite birth, life, and death in the same soil for half a century, because to the noble class, identity wasn't memory, it was documentation, and the poor weren't allowed to have it. This manipulation of lineage became a tool of legal theft, a way for the powerful to absorb small farms, grazing fields, water access, without swinging a sword. All it took was a claim, and the absence of your name on a scroll somewhere in the scribe's chamber. And those scrolls, they were locked in castles, churches, and estates. You couldn't check them. You couldn't contest them. And even if your neighbors testified on your behalf, they were often ignored, because a noble's word weighed more than a villager's truth. So people began inventing surnames out of fear, not to honor ancestors, but to protect land, to create a record, any record, of their right to exist. Some even carved their names onto tools or fences, paid priests to write crude family trees in the margins of church books, anything that might anchor them to something the law could not erase. Because in a world ruled by titles and parchment, survival wasn't about strength. It was about proof, and without it, your inheritance, your father's field, your mother's home, your childhood goat, even your right to bury your dead in a specific place could be taken. With no blade drawn, no battle fought, just a single sentence from someone richer than you. This man has no lineage, and just like that, everything you loved became theirs. You were blocked from joining guilds without a proven name. In the bustling cobbled streets of medieval towns, where the clang of blacksmiths echoed and the scent of fresh bread drifted from bakery stalls, guilds were the true engines of economic life. These were more than trade unions. They were power structures, gatekeepers, guardians of tradition, and for anyone hoping to rise from apprentice to master, to earn a living through honest skill, there was one question that mattered above all. Who was your father? Because in the world of medieval guilds, talent alone wasn't enough. You needed a name, a proven name, one that linked you to a family, a trade, a bloodline. Without it, you could be a genius with a hammer, a miracle with a loom, or an artist with a chisel, and still find every door slammed shut. Guilds were built on lineage, legacy, and the trust that came with knowing a man's origins. In an age without ID cards, background checks, or formal resumes, your identity was judged not just by your hands, but by your heritage. If your father had been a shoemaker, and his father a shoemaker, then you were halfway through the guild's gate before you lifted the tool. But if you were the orphan of unknown parentage, the son of a peasant, a wandering apprentice from another region with no documented ties, you were a risk, and guilds did not take risks. Each craft, from stonemasons and carpenters to weavers and goldsmiths, had a tightly controlled structure. To protect their monopolies, they strictly regulated who could work, how, and for how much. This meant They guarded membership like treasure. Only those who could name their lineage, prove their origin, and demonstrate a clear connection to a guild family were admitted. It was not just about blood, it was about belonging. Guilds feared fraud, theft, and dishonor. Letting an outsider in, someone with no traceable reputation, meant exposing the trade secrets to those who hadn't earned them. A basket weaver who didn't know the local dye formulas might cheapen the craft. A mason who couldn't prove he had been properly trained might endanger lives. But often, the real concern was simpler: money and legacy. The fewer the members, the more work for those inside. And so, countless skilled men and women were turned away not for lack of ability, but for lack of a name. There are surviving guild rolls from towns like Bruges, York, and Florence, showing the brutal divide. For every accepted apprentice, there were many more who simply vanished from the record. Often, these were bastards, orphans, refugees, people whose lives had been fractured by war, famine, or plague. Some had learned their craft informally from a neighbor or a wandering worker, but when they presented themselves to a guild, the question was always the same: who taught you? If the answer wasn't recognized, the door stayed shut. Some tried to fake it, claiming fathers, fabricating trade histories, forging letters, but guild elders weren't easily fooled. Sponsors were required, witnesses called. Even town priests were sometimes consulted to verify baptisms and family names. Without that thread tying you to the tapestry of tradition, you were a ghost in the eyes of the guild. Others took more dangerous paths. They practiced illegally, so-called black market craftsmen. Working without guild approval, they set up in alleys, in fields outside the town walls, or under false names. They were chased, fined, even jailed. A blacksmith, caught forging blades without a guild stamp, might have his tools seized and his hand broken. But still they worked, because hunger doesn't wait for papers. And what of the most gifted? The true outliers, those rare few whose hands could shape gold like silk or build arches that defied gravity. Even they struggled. In one recorded case from Paris in 1417, a stonemason named Martin, who had no father's name and no letters of apprenticeship, was denied entry into the Masons' Guild, despite producing a vaulted model that stunned the inspectors. They praised his skill and turned him away. The reason? His name carries no weight. Some guilds eventually softened. Over time, a few allowed admittance by merit. If a master vouched for you, or you performed a masterpiece that stunned the council, but these cases were rare and always controversial, because at its core, the guild system was about control. Control of quality, control of tradition, control of identity, and identity in the medieval world was inherited. If you could not name your father, your place of birth, your village of origin, then you did not exist in the ways that mattered. You could work, but only in the shadows. You could build, but never claim what you built. You could create, but never be called a craftsman. So while the bells of the guild halls rang out in pride, and the masters raised their mugs in feast, countless nameless hands labored outside, their genius hidden, their lives unrecorded. They were denied, not for what they could do, but for who they could not prove they were. And that, perhaps, is one of the quietest tragedies of the medieval world. The talents we never saw, the art we never named, the future stolen by the absence of a single word, father. Church records could lose track of your entire family line. You might think history remembers you, that if you were baptized, married, buried by a priest, then your name, your life, your bloodline would survive on parchment forever. But in medieval Europe, memory was paper thin, and for many, it vanished in a single line of ink. The church was the keeper of time. It recorded your birth with holy water, your marriage with a blessing, your death with a prayer, but it recorded almost everything the same way. A first name, a vague date, sometimes just a season, no surnames, no identifiers, no way to know which William was your father, or which John married, which Alice. And so, just 2 generations later, an entire family tree could collapse into fog. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a system built on assumption. In the year 1312, a child might be baptized as Thomas, son of John. But 5 other Thomases were born that year, all to men named John. No village distinction, no job title, no house number, just Thomas. Later, a marriage record reads, Thomas wed Anne. But which Thomas? Which Anne? The names echo like a chorus down the parchment, and when the next priest takes over, when the ink fades, the pages rot, the handwriting changes. What survives? A name, nothing more, and with that, the past unravels. In many English and French parishes, by the 1400s, entire family lines became untraceable. People knew they had grandparents, cousins, ancestors, but the trail simply vanished, blurred by repetition, drowned in identical names, lost to fire, flood, or mold. It's easy to forget that record-keeping was not sacred. It was rushed, incomplete, managed by men with failing eyesight, blunt quills, and no standard form. Some parishes kept detailed ledgers, others scribbled names on scraps of reused parchment. Entire decade tithes might be summarized on one page, and if you moved, if you married in another town, if a priest forgot to log your child's baptism, it was as if you never existed. Even noble families with crests and land faced this. A misplaced document meant legal battles over inheritance. A disputed name meant contested bloodlines. One missing letter could separate you from legitimacy and from legacy, but the poor suffered most. Their names were often recorded with contempt or carelessness. No mention of age, no note of occupation. Some registers describe a death simply as an old woman died, buried at dusk. No name, no family, just a fading memory. And what about those who died during plague years? The ink ran dry from overuse. Priests couldn't keep up. Hundreds of deaths were lumped together. 20 souls buried this week. No rites, no records. Children gone before they had names. Parents lost before they could pass their story on. One famine, one fire, one overworked priest. That's all it took for a family line to vanish. We think of identity as permanent, but in the medieval world, it was barely more than breath. One mistake, and the thread snapped, and for generations afterward, people lived in the shadow of forgotten names. They knew they came from somewhere. They just didn't know where, and that uncertainty shaped them. Some created false lineages, imaginary grandfathers, invented noble ties, just to fill the emptiness. Others embraced anonymity, became known only by their trade, Smith, Fletcher, Cooper, not because it was true, but because it was something to hold on to when the past gave no answers. Today, we sift through digital archives, DNA tests, genealogy websites. We try to reach back into the darkness and find the names that were lost, but many are gone forever, not because they weren't important, but because the world didn't think they were worth remembering. And that may be the cruelest truth of all, that a life lived, full of love, struggle, work, laughter, can be reduced to a smudged name in a brittle book, or worse, nothing. So next time you see a name like John, son of John, remember, behind that line was a world, a voice, a heartbeat, and just beyond it, a family trying not to disappear. Your children were often given new names by officials. Imagine giving birth to a child only to have someone else name them. Not a friend, not a godparent, not even someone who knew you, but a priest, a tax collector, a bureaucrat with ink-stained fingers and no concern for who you were. This was not fantasy. This was medieval Normandy, and it happened more often than you'd think. In the 10th and the 12th to 14th centuries, names weren't just personal, they were administrative. Parish priests maintained baptismal records, taxmen filed rolls for feudal dues, lords tracked the peasantry to ensure loyalty and payment, and when they didn't recognize a name or couldn't spell it, they changed it. Your child, whom you lovingly called Pierre or Agathe or Therolde, could appear in the local ledger as Perrault, Agnes, or something entirely foreign to your tongue. The justification? Order, clarity, uniformity. But in truth, it was convenience. Because the officials didn't ask, they assumed, and once it was written down in the church registry or the census scroll, it became real. That was the name your child was baptized under. That was the name used in court. That was the name etched on their soul, and eventually their gravestone. Your own language didn't matter. Your family traditions didn't matter. What mattered was whether the clerk understood your accent, whether the priest preferred Latinized endings, whether the taxman thought Jean sounded too close to Jean and scratched one out for the other. It wasn't always malicious, but it was erasure, and it changed lives. Take the example of a Norman peasant family in 1302. The father's name was Haimon, an old, regionally unique name passed down 3 generations. He named his firstborn son after himself, proud and beaming at the baptismal font. But the priest, trained in Latin texts, disliked the mon suffix. He wrote down Aime instead, a completely different name associated with the southern provinces. The father objected. The priest replied, "God knows him by this name now." There was no appeal, and from that day forward, the boy's life, his legal identity, his documents, his future, was tied to a name his father had never spoken. Some families tried to fight it. They called their children by one name at home and another in the church records. But over time, the official name won, because that's the name used to assign taxes. That's the name on the feudal conscription list. That's the name whispered in court, written in contracts, spoken when punishments were handed down. In some cases, children were even named based on traits or insults. A particularly thin baby might be dubbed le sifflet, the whistle. A sickly child could be assigned Morton, meaning deadly one. These names weren't affectionate. They were observations, labels, and once entered into record, they stuck like barnyard mud. Imagine your child being known forever by the flippant choice of a stranger. Imagine trying to pass down your name, your legacy, only to watch it overwritten by a pen you didn't control. That was the reality, not just in Normandy, but across much of Europe, where bureaucracy met tradition. Tradition lost. We like to think names are sacred, that they connect us to our families, that they tell stories. But in medieval times, a name was also a tool, a stamp, a designation used by those in power to track, sort, and define you, regardless of what you called yourself. And sometimes, even your children forgot the name they were born with, because the world never used it. That's the quiet horror of it. Not dramatic, not bloody, but invasive. It stole not your body, but your lineage. Not your life, but your identity. A theft written in ink. And so, buried in the archives of the Norman villages, are names that never belonged to the people who bore them. Silent graves marked by foreign syllables. Generations that drifted further and further from their roots. simply because an official made a choice on a winter morning and no one questioned it. Today, we name our children with care, but once you could carry a name not given in love, but assigned like a number. And the saddest part, no one ever said it wasn't yours. You couldn't testify against the Lord's men without name status. In the great halls of medieval justice, where law was dispensed beneath carved beams and lords presided from high-backed chairs, truth bowed to status. There were rules, of course, codes, traditions, oaths, but there was also a quiet, cruel barrier that no parchment ever listed, yet everyone understood. You could not speak against the powerful if you were no one. In manorial courts across England, France, and much of feudal Europe, peasants without the documented names, those with no land, no lineage, no tax registration, were often stripped of a basic right, the right to testify, and not just in any case, but specifically when the accused belonged to the Lord's household, his guards, his estate managers, his knights. The very men charged with enforcing order could not, in many places, be legally accused by those deemed too low to speak. Imagine what that meant. If a serf was beaten by a guard for stepping off the path, if a maid was assaulted by a steward in the granary, if a tenant's grain was stolen by a knight's men during the collection of tithes, they could scream, they could cry, they could plead, but if they lacked what manorial law called naming status, a full name tied to property, guild, or a recognized household, their voice carried no weight. The court might let them speak for appearance's sake, but the record would note no standing to testify, and just like that, their pain vanished into silence. This system wasn't an accident. It was built deliberately, layered into the fabric of feudalism like mortar between stones. Lords needed their men to keep order. That meant soldiers, reeves, managers, and enforcers needed protection, not just on the battlefield, but in court. And the easiest way to protect them? Ensure that their accusers couldn't speak. The justification was always the same, that nameless peasants were too socially insignificant to give reliable testimony, that they lacked education, moral standing, or proper ties to the community. In some court records, they were called ruthless or untrustworthy by class. A knight's oath, it was said, outweighed a peasant's words, even if the knight was the one holding the whip. But this wasn't just legal posturing, it was lived reality. In a manorial court in Kent in 1327, a woman named Marjorie, simply Marjorie with no recorded surname, accused the estate steward of forcing himself upon her in the stables. She had bruises, she had witnesses, but those witnesses were her cousins, also unnamed peasants, none of whom held land or titles. The steward denied everything. The court noted, no lawful persons to confirm. Case dismissed. Marjorie was fined for false accusation. In Burgundy, in 1303, a thatcher named Guillaume tried to testify that a lord's guards had stolen a portion of his winter firewood. The reeve laughed. Guillaume had no recorded surname, no property, no tax history. His firewood was never returned. He was beaten for defaming the Lord's name. In some regions, the law was explicit. Only men of legal standing, meaning those recorded in the manor rolls, could bring formal accusation against the Lord's men. This made it nearly impossible for poor tenants or itinerant laborers to find justice. They could be wronged, abused, robbed, even maimed, and still be told that their voice didn't count. The injustice was not just in the courtroom, but in the structure of trust itself, because to testify in court, especially in matters involving power, was to risk retaliation, and if the court already doubted your voice, then any such risk became not just futile, but dangerous. There are accounts of peasants being punished for trying to testify, whipped for causing disruption, banned from market access, cast out as slanderers, all for telling the truth that the system was designed to ignore. And yet, some tried anyway. They came to court, knowing they might be turned away. They spoke even when the clerks refused to record their words. Some appealed to the church, hoping that a sympathetic abbot or friar might believe what the court would not. Others whispered their stories to neighbors, hoping that collective outrage might do what law would not. There are rare, fragile cases where such voices broke through. In 1342, a group of villagers in Yorkshire banded together after a guard that killed a boy during a grain dispute. The boy's family had no naming status, but the entire village swore together, 20 men and women, all without property, forcing the steward to back down. The case was not recorded in court rolls, but was passed down orally for generations. The village remembered, even if the system didn't, and that, perhaps, is the most haunting part. These people lived, they bled, they spoke, but the courts, bound by ink and hierarchy, rendered them invisible. Their stories, unless echoed by a landowner or a priest, disappeared like breath in winter. So what was justice in such a world? It was not the scales held by an impartial hand. It was a wall. And if you had no name, no lineage, no land, then you stood outside of it, pounding on the stone and hoping someone on the other side might bother to listen. But they rarely did, because in manorial Europe, silence wasn't a failure of law. It was the law. You had no way to claim ancestral rights or boundaries. In the quiet folds of a 14th century English village, land was life. Not money, not title, land, a strip of pasture, a crumbling stone wall, a communal well your grandmother once drew water from with calloused hands. But none of it was truly yours, not unless your name was written, not unless your lineage was sealed, because in the eyes of the law, land didn't belong to those who worked it, bled on it, or buried their dead in it. It belonged to those who could prove they had the right to it, and proof required writing. Steward logs, charters, seals, and most villagers had none. Their names changed with the seasons. John of the Marsh, then John the Younger, then John who married Alice. Not a surname, not a legacy, just a label to distinguish one soul from another in a town where everyone looked like family. But that's the thing, they were family, generations deep. Their ancestors had split land by handshake, shared wells by agreement, passed fences, trees, grazing rights, not with parchment, but with memory. And memory was everything, until it wasn't, because memory couldn't stand in court. The Lord Steward would write in with a leather-bound log, written in ink that hadn't faded. In it, names were recorded, names that stayed the same, names with power, names that belonged to people who lived elsewhere, but claimed to own the very soil your children played on. And when there was a dispute, you had no name they recognized, no surname to trace, no documents, no signature, just stories. And stories, they said, weren't proof. So when a neighboring village man claimed that the well you used belonged to his family and showed a steward's note from 1320 with a name like Robert Atwill, you were defenseless, because your own ancestors were never written down. They weren't important enough. And now, your lineage vanished beneath someone else's ink. Your right to draw water revoked, your grazing patch reassigned. Even the stones marking your father's grave could be moved, declared unbound, because no written deed declared your family had ever lived here. And if you objected, you were called a trespasser, a thief on your own land. Villagers tried to fight back, not with weapons, but with witnesses, grandmothers testifying in trembling voices, neighbors swearing on memory. But none of it was official. None of it could match the written name backed by the title, coin, or crown. So they carved initials into trees, buried tokens beneath boundary stones, told children bedtime stories, not of monsters, but of family lines, who lived where, who shared what, who never crossed that ditch because it marked the start of Cousin Edwin's field. It was all oral, all delicate, all invisible to those who counted. And over time, one by one, the borders faded, a stone moved by a storm, a hedge trimmed too far, a fence rebuilt with new stakes, just slightly off, and when you couldn't prove it was wrong, you lost it, because in medieval law, possession wasn't 9/10 of the law. Proof was, and if your name wasn't proof, your entire family history became dust. This is how ancestral rights disappeared, not in war, not in revolt, but in quiet erasure, line by line, field by field, until the people who had lived there the longest became the ones with the least. Their land handed off to those with paper, their stories drowned beneath signatures, and their identity reduced to rootless peasant. Not because they lacked ancestors, but because they lacked permission to remember them. So when you look at a map today, dotted with ancient land names, ask yourself, whose land was it, really? And who lost it? Not through conquest, but through silence? You might be named after an insulting animal by locals. In the medieval world, where the line between survival and obscurity was thin, your name was more than just a word. It was your passport to society, your label, your brand. But what if you didn't get to choose it? What if your name was chosen for you by mockery? In towns and villages across medieval Europe, if you lacked a formal surname, something common for peasants, vagrants, or newcomers, you didn't remain nameless for long. Locals would fill in the gap, often with something memorable, but memorable didn't mean kind. You might find yourself branded not with your father's name, but with an animal insult. Goose John, Pigface Margaret, Dog Ear Will. These weren't jokes whispered behind someone's back. These were the names that stuck. They appeared on tax records, on church rolls, on public punishments and fines. And once they were written in ink, they became official, permanent. How did this happen? In small communities, identity had to be practical. You couldn't say John and expect anyone to know which John you meant. There might be 5 Johns in the village: John the Miller, John the Tall One, John the Bastard, and so on. So townsfolk adapted. They attached nicknames, descriptors, or personality traits, and when someone stood out, awkwardly, loudly, poorly, they often got stuck with a name they never asked for. If you were clumsy, goose was a favorite insult. Geese were seen as silly, skittish, and noisy. If your face was ruddy or broad, pigface was cruelly applied. If you were unkempt, dog ear or sheephead might follow. Women were not spared either. Margaret the widow might become Hen Meg, or if she was suspected of gossip, Magpie Margaret. And these weren't merely insults whispered in alleys, they were codified. In 1382, a poor man in Norfolk was fined for unpaid taxes. The court record lists him as Robert Oxbrain, a name he'd been given after locals mocked him for being slow-witted and stubborn. That's how he was taxed. That's how he was judged. These names could follow families for generations. A man mocked as Fox Allen for being sly might pass on the name to his son, who would never escape it, no matter how honest he lived. Over time, some of these insults hardened into real surnames. Goose, hog, fox, wolf, lamb, drake, and even bigot can be traced back to these brutal nicknames. What began as ridicule became legacy. Why animals? Because in medieval society, animals weren't cute metaphors. They were moral symbols. To be called a fox was to be a liar, a sheep, a coward, a pig, gluttonous or unclean. These weren't random labels. They were judgments on your character, broadcast every time your name was spoken. And once the label was stuck to you, escaping it was nearly impossible. Even if you moved towns, these names often traveled with you. A priest might refer to you by that name in parish books. A lord might record your fine using it. When your children were baptized, that name might be etched onto them too. And if you tried to correct someone, if you said, "I'm not Pigface Margaret, my name is just Margaret," they'd laugh. Or worse, think you were getting above your station, because in medieval towns, names weren't just identifiers. They were weapons. Weapons that townsfolk used to keep others in their place. If you were poor, odd-looking, too quiet, too loud, or from a disgraced family, you became the cow, the goat, the boar, and it didn't matter what your heart held. What mattered was how you looked, how you moved, how others laughed when you passed. And still, life went on. These people farmed, married, buried their dead. They lived full lives under names not their own, names given by mockery, sanctioned by society, and made permanent by parchment. We see their ghostly echoes in our surnames today. We might laugh at them now, hogge, goose, fox, sheep, but they began not as symbols of heritage, but of humiliation. So the next time you sign your name, pause and imagine what it would mean to carry the weight of a joke forever. Because in the medieval world, if you couldn't name yourself, the world would do it for you, and it rarely showed mercy. Your grave might go unmarked or misattributed. You spend your life working, praying, bleeding, hoping, and when it ends, you think at least your name will remain. But in medieval Europe, most people didn't even get that. For the average man or woman, peasant, servant, laborer, death came quietly, without ceremony, without stone, without words carved in memory. You were buried not with identity, but with anonymity, and often with the wrong name entirely. Graves were not always marked. Most were not. Crosses were simple wooden stakes, hastily carved and quickly rotted by weather. Names, if added, faded in months. Others weren't named at all. The priest might scribble, "Old woman died near market," or "Child expired in the night." No surname, no lineage, no clue. The medieval church kept burial records in scattered, inconsistent formats, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in dialect, sometimes not at all. A village priest might record 50 deaths on a single page, using only first names, or worse, none. 7 souls buried this week. 3 were children, 1 woman unnamed. That was it. That was your eternity. Even when names were written down, errors spread quickly. Names were misspelled, confused, or duplicated. And without surnames to separate you from the other Johns, the other Thomases, the other Alices, your identity blurred like ink on wet parchment. In mass graves, common during plague years or harsh winters, bodies were stacked together, often buried without rites. There was no time, no markers, sometimes not even coffins. The dead became indistinguishable, a pile of limbs, a prayer whispered over dirt, then forgotten. One chronicle from Yorkshire, dated 1349, records over 100 souls buried beyond the wall. Names too many and too tangled to keep. Tangled. That's how history saw them. Not as individuals, but as knots, confusion, errors to be managed, not lives to be honored. Even in smaller villages, where families lived side by side for generations, graves were regularly misattributed. A field hand named Robert might be buried where John was meant to lie, but no one noticed, or if they did, they said nothing, because what mattered was the ritual, not the truth, and so entire family lines disappeared. Try to trace them now, and you'll find silence, blank spaces in family trees, a baptism record without a burial, a marriage line that leads nowhere. And if you find a grave, it's often wrong. The marker may be for someone else. The bones below may have never been named. Some families try to mark graves with stone, but even then, it was a risk. Stone was expensive. Few could afford it. Those who did often reused old markers, chiseling new names into old slabs. But who checked? Who made sure the body beneath matched the name above? No one. And so death became a second erasure. The first was poverty. The second was forgetting. Women were even more likely to vanish. They often changed names after marriage, if they had one at all. Church records might list them only as wife of Thomas or widow of John. If they died unmarried, they might simply be Alice, spinster, or girl of poor health. Their stories, lost, their deaths, filed under someone else's shadow. The result? Entire generations buried without being remembered, not from malice, but from neglect, from a system that did not see the value in preserving the lives of the ordinary. You worked, you suffered, you died, and your body returned to the earth with no one left to say your name out loud. Even monasteries, tasked with preserving knowledge, failed in this duty. Their graveyards were full of the nameless, rows of plain crosses, some toppled, some burned, many reused. In some abbeys, bones were dug up to make room for new bodies, and the old ones were tossed into charnel pits, forever stripped of identity. It didn't have to be this way, but the medieval world wasn't built to remember the poor. It was built to remember the powerful. Kings had tombs, nobles had effigies, monks had inscribed slabs, but the rest? The laborers who built the castles, the women who raised the children, the shepherds, the bakers, the lost? Their graves are silent, their names dissolved. We study history through what was recorded, but what about those who weren't? What about the millions who lived and died without a line, without a stone, without a trace? They are the invisible majority, and maybe, just maybe, they are the ones we should remember most, because they remind us that identity is fragile, that history doesn't remember everyone, that one storm, one careless scribe, one unmarked burial can erase you for good. And yet, they were here. They breathed. They loved. They deserved more than a shallow grave and a forgotten name. And now, centuries later, as we walk through fields and old churchyards, we owe them this: to speak the names we still have, and to imagine those we don't. You couldn't be remembered in town, chronicles or war rolls. They fought, they bled, they died, but history forgot them, because they had no surname. In medieval Europe, from the 13th through the 15th centuries, war was constant. Kingdoms clashed, banners rose, men marched into fields of mud and fire. And in the aftermath, when the scrolls were written and the records drawn, it mattered not how brave you were, or how long you held the line. It mattered whether they knew what to write beside your name, because if you had no surname, you were nobody. The official war rolls, lists of soldiers granted payment, honor, or burial rights, required full identifiers. These rolls were used to issue pensions, to pay widows, to record valor. But if you entered the ranks as simply Thomas, John, or Ralph the Tall, and fell before a clerk ever saw your face, you were marked as unknown infantrymen, or worse, not marked at all. In the 1346 records from the Battle of Crécy, one of England's most significant victories, over 15% of the fallen are listed without surname or designation, just blank spaces. A bowman, a foot soldier, a man of no mark. They weren't cowards, they weren't deserters, they were just poor, and the poor men didn't have surnames. They came from hamlets with no church, farms with no land deeds. They weren't William of Ashbridge or Henry Fitzallen. They were Will, who fixed carts, Hen, who shoveled dung, and when arrows tore through them, when they screamed beneath hoofs and banners, their voices were real, but the scrolls stayed silent, because the scribes couldn't write what they didn't know. Sometimes the captains tried. They'd list a man by trade or trait, Simon the Lame, Edgar with a hare lip, but those were not names that earned honor. They were placeholders, scribbles, words meant to fill the space where dignity should have been. If you survived, you could claim your pension. If someone knew you, if you died, you vanished. And in the towns they left behind, the Chronicles, those precious ledgers kept by priests, monks, and reeves, did not remember them either. Only the notable were recorded: the knight, the reeve's son, the merchant's brother, not the nameless archer who took 3 bolts to the chest shielding a retreat, not the scullery boy who followed his lord into battle and drowned in a trench. Their stories lived only in memory, in whispers, in grief-soaked bedtime stories told by mothers to children who would never know their father's face, because the parchment was blank, because the ink was never dipped for them. This is the quiet violence of history, not the blood spilled in war, but the silence that follows, the way it edits the dead, the way it draws lines around whose story is worth telling. We forget that the surnames we take for granted now, Hughes, Baker, Fletcher, Marsh, came from a time when names were privileges, not birthrights, and those without them were at the mercy of memory. Some tried to fix it. A few centuries later, as surnames became more standardized, families would invent origins. They'd claim their ancestor was the John at Poitiers, the Thomas who held the bridge. But there was no proof, no scroll, no pension, only longing, only silence. Even today, historians studying medieval battles struggle to count the true dead, because for every knight whose crest was recorded, dozens of commoners lie buried in unmarked graves, folded beneath fields now sown with wheat, their bones remembered by no monument, their names spoken only by the wind. They were not unknown because they lacked courage. They were unknown because they lacked paper. And so we must remember not just the men whose names survive in brass and oak, but the ones whose only legacy is the space their name should have filled, the empty line, the erased hero, the forgotten soldier who died as bravely as any lord, but was buried without a word. Officials gave you numbers or colors instead of real identity. In the crowded winding alleys of medieval Italian cities, Florence, Siena, Bologna, the hum of labor was constant. Hammers striking stone, wheels turning looms, voices echoing from markets and workshops. These cities were alive, pulsing with commerce and ambition. But beneath the surface of art and architecture, behind the facades of merchant houses and basilicas, a quieter injustice unfolded. The nameless were being numbered. For the countless workers who laid the stones of cathedrals, cleaned the sewers of the Arno, or wove thread in underground chambers, identity was a luxury they were not afforded. They had no surname, no guild affiliation, no family crest. And in the records of the city, ledgers, payrolls, census rolls, there was no room for ambiguity. So the officials gave them labels: Giovanni Rosso, Alessandro Tre, Marco di Giallo, Pietro Sei, At first glance, they seem like names, but they were not. Rosso, red, wasn't a family name. It referred to the color of the man's hat or tunic or hair. Tre was not a surname, it was a number. The third Alessandro hired that week, these were not identities, they were tags, placeholders, tools of administrative control designed to track laborers, too poor, too transient, or too irrelevant to be recorded properly. To the city's bureaucrats, it made sense. How do you pay 20 Giovannis who come and go with no surname? You give them colors, or numbers, or nicknames. Giovanni Tall, Giovanni Black, Giovanni 10. And when they leave, when they die, when they vanish into the city's churning workforce, you just reuse the tag, assign it to the next nameless man who shows up with calloused hands and empty pockets. But this system, this brutal simplicity, came at a cost. It stripped people of lineage. It made their lives impossible to trace. And generations later, it left entire families with no idea who they came from. In the payrolls of Florence's wool guild in the late 13th century, dozens of workers are listed only as Francesco Verde or Matteo Uno. When later scribes tried to understand who these men were, whether they stayed, had children, lived past the famine years, they found only confusion. Which Francesco Verde, the one who worked in the northern district, the one who died in the plague, or the one who came back after being gone for 5 years and claimed his back wages under a name that wasn't even his? This dehumanization wasn't just administrative, it was existential. Names carry memory. They anchor us to our past, to others, to place. A surname can link generations, preserve legacies, protect inheritance, ensure justice. But when officials replaced names with numbers or colors, they weren't just simplifying, they were erasing, making people fungible, replaceable, interchangeable bodies whose only purpose was labor and whose only history was a mark in a ledger. And this system had consequences far beyond the page. If a laborer was injured on the job, say a stone mason in Siena crushed beneath a failed arch, his record might simply read, Giovanni Quattro, deceased. His family, if they existed, might not even know. If they came to claim his wages, they had to prove he was their Giovanni Quattro. But how do you prove that when there were 5 others with the same tag? Some never received the pay. Some never found the body. In some cases, names passed in eternal error between unrelated men. There is a chilling example in the archives of Bologna in 1309. 2 men labeled Pietro Cinque working the same job site. One dies. The surviving Pietro claims the wages and his name. Over time, that label sticks. His descendants carry it, but it wasn't his. The real Pietro Cinque, his bloodline, his name, is lost, erased by a bureaucratic mix-up no one corrected. And yet, perhaps most painfully, this system robbed the people of dignity in their own lifetime. To walk through a city and be known not by your name, but by a number? To be summoned by a color like livestock? Hey, Rosso, your turn. Otte, unload the cart. These were not men to the system. They were functions, and if they spoke up, tried to protest, claimed the right to recognition, they were reminded that records were for the landed, the titled, the known. In a world where guilds protected their own, where citizenship meant visibility, and where names were passports to protection, those without true identity were shadows. They labored, they suffered, they died, and the only trace they left was a smear of ink beside a number. Even the church, the great record keeper of medieval Europe, could not save them. Baptismal records were often absent or flawed. A child baptized as Antonio might never be listed again, only reappear years later as Antonio Due, when hired for ditch work, unrecognizable from the baby once blessed at the altar. And so, centuries later, historians pore over ledgers and wonder, who was Giovanni Red? What happened to Elena Set? Were they real? Were they even the same people each time? We may never know, because the cities remembered their work, but not their names. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest form of forgetting. You couldn't legally pass down your occupation or tools. In the cobbled trade cities of Bruges and Ghent, prosperity didn't come from land, it came from tools. A loom, a set of chisels, a forge, passed from father to son. These were the lifeblood of the medieval working class. A man's trade was his survival and his legacy. In a world ruled by guilds and sealed apprenticeships, to be a craftsman wasn't just a job, it was an identity, a passport to economic protection, a ticket into the town's inner circles. But there was a catch. You had to have a name, not just a name spoken in the market, but a name written, a surname, a legal identity that could be recognized, repeated, and passed on. Without it, your children inherited nothing, not your tools, not your shop, not your position in the guild, nothing. It didn't matter if your son had worked beside you since he could walk, if he knew every stitch, every spark, every curve of the tools you shaped with your own hands. If he lacked a written surname attached to yours, he wasn't your legal heir. He was a stranger to the trade, a nobody, and the guilds had no room for nobodies. They had rules, iron rules, forged not in cruelty, but in fear. Fear of untrained labor, of trade secrets leaking, of chaos in a world already fraying at its edges. And so, they required lineage, proof, a paper trail, signed and witnessed. So when the master cobbler died in Ghent, and his eldest son came to claim the stall, the guild demanded documentation. The boy had no surname, just a first name shared by a dozen others, so the stall was given to another. The tools were reclaimed by the guild, and the boy, he was cast back into the labor pool, back to begging for apprenticeship under men who had once called his father master. This happened across generations. A weaver in Bruges spent 40 years perfecting his technique. Thread so fine, it was sold in the courts of France. But when he died, his daughter, trained since girlhood, better than any man in the guild, was denied the right to inherit his equipment. No surname, no charter, no trade. So the loom was sold. The girl vanished into the outskirts of town, reduced to mending rags for coin, her family's legacy erased in one decision. Because in medieval trade cities, work was not just about skill. It was about structure, and the structure was guarded. To pass down your craft, you had to pass down your name. Not a nickname, not a village reference, a legally recognized, guild-approved surname. Without it, your child was a liability, an unknown, an outsider to the very craft that raised them. This was especially brutal in times of disease, famine, or war. When parents died young and children were left to pick up the pieces, they had the tools, they had the knowledge, but the system didn't care. If you weren't named properly, you weren't anyone. And the tools, those sacred, worn extensions of their parents' hands, were repossessed, melted, auctioned, given to someone with paperwork, not family, just proof. Some tried to fight it. Parents bribed scribes to create retroactive charters. They forged baptismal records. They paid priests to speak in court, swearing the child was legitimate. But the guilds were relentless. One missing seal, one error in spelling, one contradictory record, and the inheritance was denied. And if your child tried to continue your work in secret, they risked punishment. Guilds enforced boundaries with fines, with exile, with confiscation. In some cases, even jail. This wasn't rare. It was systematized, a machine that ran on names, names tied to signatures, signatures tied to tools, tools tied to trade, and trade tied to survival. In the glowing cities of Bruges and Ghent, where trade flowed like blood through narrow alleys, your worth wasn't written in sweat or calluses. It was written in ink. And if the ink didn't know you, you didn't exist. So fathers whispered their surnames into their children's ears like prayers. Mothers carved them into handles, hid them in shoes, prayed they would be remembered, because one wrong name meant your entire family history could disappear, not from memory, but from record, and that was enough to make you vanish. Fines or deaths were charged to the wrong people. In the tangled records of medieval life, ink-smudged scrolls, oral accounts, and half-remembered deaths, a single name could become a noose, and if that name happened to be yours, you could have paid the price for another man's sins, simply because no one bothered to tell you apart. Fines and taxes were rigid institutions in the medieval world. Manorial lords, sheriffs, and church authorities relied on them to keep the feudal machine grinding forward. But for all the weight they carried, the systems that enforced them were primitive. Crude lists scratched onto parchment, names scribbled without identifiers, no birth dates, no precise addresses, no surnames in most cases. And so, if you happen to be named William, son of Richard, and another William, son of Richard, in the next village, failed to pay his tithe or broke a local bylaw, the death could land squarely at your door. And when it didn't knock politely. You might be walking through the village square when a reeve or bailiff stopped you, reading from a scroll. You owe 5 shillings for unpaid grazing taxes, or you were fined 2 goats for cutting wood from the Lord's forest. You try to protest. I have no goats. I've never even been to that forest. But it doesn't matter. The name matches. The record is official. Your guilt presumed. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a sentence. In many cases, refusal or inability to pay meant physical punishment, public stocks, whipping. In some regions, debtors could be jailed indefinitely. One innocent man, mistaken for a notorious poacher in Shropshire in 1388, spent over 2 weeks in a manorial jail before the real offender was caught. The records note this only in passing, as a clerical correction, no apology, no compensation, and that's the crux of the injustice. There was no system for appeal, no concept of mistaken identity as a legal defense. If your name was attached to the debt, and someone couldn't or wouldn't untangle the truth, you bore the punishment. You might lose your sheep, your tools, your family's meager savings. You might even be banished from your village entirely. This problem was so common that in certain towns, officials developed local workarounds. Some priests and clerks began annotating names with physical traits, John the Short, Alice with the red scarf, to help distinguish people in tax rolls. Others appended occupational tags, Thomas the Cooper, William the Scytheman. These efforts gave birth to what would later evolve into surnames. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, it was a patchwork solution, applied inconsistently and often too late. The implications reached beyond tax rolls. Imagine being denied entry into a guild because someone else with your name had once stolen from a master, or being refused the right to marry in the church because your name appeared on a list of excommunicated sinners. Someone else's crime, someone else's disgrace, now hung on your back like a shroud. In one chilling example from 1411 in Yorkshire, a man was executed for theft after his name appeared in connection with a horse stolen weeks earlier. A local friar, later testified that the man had been in a different village during the theft, but the judgment stood. The record had said, Robert, son of Hugh. That was enough. Even when errors were eventually caught, they were rarely rectified. The bureaucracy of medieval justice did not account for innocence once punishment was meted. It was easier for the system to move on than to unravel itself. Families tried to protect themselves by adding lineage tags. Henry of the Old Mill, or Joan, daughter of Matthew the Smith. But these could fade over time, or be omitted by lazy scribes. And if you moved, trying to start over in a new town, you might find yourself punished again for deaths or crimes you had never heard of, all because someone there had your name? In a world where literacy was rare and record-keeping rudimentary, your name was both your identity and your vulnerability. You couldn't change it. You couldn't outrun it. You lived at the mercy of how others recorded it and how carelessly they applied it. So when we read the dry lines of medieval tax rolls or court ledgers, we must remember every repeated name could be a repeat tragedy. Every fine paid by the wrong man, every punishment endured by the innocent, is a reminder of how fragile justice can be when identity is treated as little more than a line of ink on fading parchment. And perhaps the cruelest part, you didn't even have to know the man who bore your name, but if he failed, you paid. You had no say in choosing how you were represented in records. Your name, your face, your story. You think they belong to you, but in the medieval world, they didn't. Not really, because the way you were remembered, the way you were recorded, was not in your hands. It was in the ink-stained fingers of a clerk, in the distracted scribbles of a priest, in the impatient notes of a taxman who never asked how your name was spelled because he didn't care. And so, year after year, document after document, you became someone slightly different. Sometimes your first name was changed. Sometimes your trade was wrong. Sometimes your gender was even reversed on accident. It didn't matter who you were, only how quickly they could file you away. And so your identity fractured. In one record, you might be Agnes of the Hill. In another, Agatha Hillwife. In a third, just woman servant. And over time, the trail of you, your life, your lineage, your legal rights vanished into fog. This was not a rare mistake. It was systemic. Scribes worked fast, not carefully. Their job was volume, not accuracy. Most people were illiterate and poor and had no way to correct errors even if they noticed them, and they never saw the final page. Once their name went into the record book, right or wrong, that was who they were now. Your name could change with the season. Your role could shift based on assumption. Your family line could vanish if a clerk didn't bother to write son of, and you had no power to fix it. In one 15th century English manor roll, a laborer appears under 3 different surnames over a 5-year span, simply because different clerks described him by his land, his job, and then a nickname. Today, historians debate whether these were 3 men or 1. No one knows for sure, because the man himself never got to say. Priests, too, often baptized children without confirming a name from the mother. If the mother was absent, or worse, unmarried, the priest might choose a holy name on her behalf. That decision followed the child forever, their birth name lost, their original identity overwritten by holy convenience. And taxmen, worse still, you might appear in a tax ledger as John with 1 cow. Then, the following year, as John near the river, and then disappear altogether if they forgot which John you were. This meant not only a broken historical trail, it meant loss of property, legal confusion, denial of inheritance. Your very existence became unstable, and women, especially women, suffered the worst. They were rarely recorded by name, often identified only as wife of Thomas or widow of Henry. A woman without a husband could be called spinster, maid, or just female. In parish documents, no continuity, no lineage, no voice. If she married, her identity changed completely, and if she remarried, she might be recorded under her new husband's name with no mention of the first. A life reduced to relationships, never to self. Some clerks added nicknames to tell people apart, but these were often humiliating. John Broken Nose, Emma the Drunk, Roger Bastard. These weren't just insults, they were official labels, used in court, used in tax, used in church records, written by someone else, sealed with authority and made permanent. And you couldn't erase them. In fact, trying to change how you were recorded could be seen as deceit, fraud, even heresy. If a priest called you Margaret and you said your name was Marin, you were wrong, not him. You had no say, no appeal. You weren't the author of your own story. You were a character written by others, and so millions of people vanished from history, not because they didn't live, but because they were misnamed, misfiled, or misremembered. Their records scattered across documents that don't align, their legal identities lost, their ancestors unable to trace them, not erased by time, but by human error, by carelessness, by power they never had. Today, we search old ledgers, hoping to reconstruct who they were. But how do you find someone who was written down 5 different ways by 5 different people? How do you follow a trail that changes names at every turn? The truth is, you often can't, and that's the tragedy, that someone could live an entire life, labor, marry, raise children, pay taxes, worship, and still be remembered as the wrong person, or worse, not remembered at all. That's what history did to them, and it could have done it to you, because in a world where others controlled the pen, you didn't just lose your rights, you lost yourself. Villagers assumed you were an orphan, or illegitimate. In the world of medieval Europe, having no surname wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a stain. It told people everything they thought they needed to know about you, even when none of it was true, because to live without a second name was to be seen as someone unwanted, unclaimed, unworthy. The villagers didn't ask questions, they assumed. If you had no surname, they believed you were an orphan, left behind by dead parents, or worse, abandoned at birth. And if you weren't an orphan, then you must be illegitimate, born outside of marriage, born in shame. And once they believed that, everything changed. You were no longer just Thomas. You were Thomas the Nameless, Thomas Bastard, Thomas No Father. These weren't just insults. They were social markers, labels that altered your worth in the eyes of the community. Because in medieval society, everything was about lineage, blood, property, God's order. Names were proof of belonging, of legality, of identity. And if you didn't have one, you didn't belong. This perception followed you everywhere. Marriage? Nearly impossible. Fathers would not give their daughters to someone whose bloodline was unknown or tainted. A girl with no surname might be pitied, but a boy with no name was distrusted, seen as unstable, dangerous, doomed to repeat the sins of whoever birthed him in silence. In the church records, such children were often given vague, uncomfortable notations of unknown father, born under veil of night, or simply bastard. And once it was written down, it followed you for life. You could be honest, faithful, hardworking, but without a name to anchor you, people assumed you were broken before you began, that your very soul was marked with absence. This wasn't just gossip, it had legal weight. Laws across England and France often denied inheritance rights to children born outside wedlock. Without a name, you couldn't prove descent. You couldn't claim land, tools, livestock, everything your parents may have left, if they'd left anything at all, was handed to others. You had no claim, and so many of the nameless lived as servants, as laborers, as drifters between villages, never fully trusted, never allowed to hold a position. Even if you found work, the reeve might list you as boy without father, and the title stuck longer than your wage. You were defined by what you lacked, not your skills, not your spirit, but your surname. In one haunting record from a 14th century Yorkshire parish, a young man was set to marry the daughter of a miller. The banns were read, the feast prepared, but on the eve of the ceremony, a neighbor came forward and said the boy had no proper surname. The priest investigated. The boy admitted he didn't know his father's name. His mother had died when he was 5. The wedding was cancelled. The guests went home. The bread went stale. The girl never married anyone else, and the boy, recorded simply as William, son of none, left the village by winter. No one ever saw him again. This is what happened when you didn't fit into the naming system. You became invisible. And yet, thousands live this way. Children born in famine, during war, after plague, mothers who died in childbirth, fathers lost to disease or conscription, midwives who never wrote anything down, priests who baptized without care. The reasons were endless, but the result was the same. A person with no surname was no person at all. Even those given names like Son of the Field or Child of the Wind were marked as suspicious. The names sounded poetic, but behind them was pain, a reminder that the child belonged to no one. We forget this now. We see names as decoration, as tradition. But in the medieval world, a name was your shield. Without it, the world cut deep. Some tried to create their own surnames, chose a profession, a birthplace, a trait, but unless the church or the Lord recognized it, it meant nothing. You could call yourself John of the Hills until your last breath, but if the reeve wrote John Bastard, that's what history remembered. Even death didn't restore your dignity. In burial rolls, the nameless were often recorded as a soul, a peasant, an unnamed man, or left off entirely. No stone, no marker, just dirt, and the silence of those who once whispered about your origin. This is the truth that history rarely tells, that countless lives, good lives, honest lives, were erased not by war or plague, but by the absence of a name. A child might survive hunger, survive winter, survive grief, but not survive assumption, not survive a world that saw a blank space where a surname should be and decided you are less, not because of who you were, but because of what you were missing. Your reputation could be stolen or damaged by another you. In the close-knit villages of medieval Europe, where everyone knew your face but not always your full name, your identity wasn't something you owned, it was something you shared, and sometimes it was something that could be stolen. If your name was William, just William, you weren't alone. In any given village, there could be 3, 5, even 10 other men with the same name. Names like John, Thomas, Alice, William, Joan, and Margaret were so common that they echoed through the lanes and fields like a shared breath. No surnames, no middle names, no birth certificates, just names and reputations. In a world where trust was survival, your reputation was your name. So what happened when another William did something wrong? Say one William was caught stealing a sack of grain from the manor storehouse, or seducing a reeve's daughter behind the chapel, or insulting a merchant at market. Word spread fast, but not clearly. It traveled through whispers, across ploughed fields, over ale cups at the tavern. Did you hear? William did it. Which William? No one could say for sure, and just like that, suspicion landed on you. You who had done nothing. You who had tilled your fields, paid your tithes, tended your animals. You who had never stolen a thing in your life. Now you were the one receiving cold stares, the one shunned at market, the one whose marriage prospects quietly dried up, the one whose landlord began watching just a bit too closely, because names in the medieval world didn't belong to individuals, they belonged to groups, and when someone in your name group fell from grace, you all did. There were attempts to fix this, of course. People tried to add markers to their names. William the Miller, William of Ashford, William with a scar, but these were informal and inconsistent. A man might be William Red Hat in one village and William of the Stream in another. If the offending William vanished, you were left with a stain and none of the evidence. And the courts? They offered little help. If you were accused of a crime and denied it, the burden was on you to prove you weren't that William. But how? There were no photographs, no records. Witnesses often confused people. In small villages, everyone wore similar clothes, worked similar jobs, and moved in similar circles. You might even share a family member's name, adding to the mess. And if the bailiff or reeve thought you looked suspicious, that was often enough. In manorial courts, it was not uncommon to see cases dismissed not for lack of crime, but for too many people with the same name. Some officials simply fined all the Williams involved and called it done. Others punished the wrong man and moved on. Justice wasn't blind, it was tired, and it didn't have the tools to sort through a name-based tangle. One court roll from Lincolnshire in 1291 reads, William was accused of taking barley from the common field. 3 men of that name were presented. Each denied it. The barley was never found. All were fined for confusion. Fined for confusion. Reputation theft wasn't always accidental either. Sometimes it was deliberate. A rival might pretend to be you when committing a crime. A jealous suitor might spread rumors under your name. A man fleeing debt might leave the village, leaving behind your good name in ruin, and there was no easy way to clean it up. Even the church struggled with this problem. Parish priests, who baptized dozens of children each year, often gave the same names over and over again, reinforcing the problem. There are records of entire baptismal pages with only 3 or 4 different first names, repeated again and again. So people adapted the only way they could. They carved new identities from context. William the Younger, William by the Oak, William with the crooked toe. These identifiers became more important than the name itself. They weren't official, but they were survival. Still, even these could be copied or forgotten, and the moment they were, your fragile distinction vanished. This confusion even echoed through generations. Descendants looking into their family history would find dozens of possible ancestors, each named William, Thomas, Alice, with no way to tell who was who. One, Joan, might be a midwife, another a thief, another the woman who vanished during the plague years. Which one was yours? The records don't say. What does that mean in the end? It means that in the medieval world, your name wasn't just a label, it was a battlefield. You could lose your reputation without ever leaving your home. You could wake up innocent and go to bed accused. And even if you lived an honest life, someone else's dishonor could become yours in a heartbeat. Because when everyone is named William, no one truly is. You couldn't claim refuge under another family's protection. In the medieval world, justice wasn't blind. It was tribal. Courts were not places where truth alone prevailed. They were battlegrounds of names, bloodlines, alliances. Who stood with you often mattered more than what you said, and if no one stood with you, if you had no name to anchor you to a group, then you were nothing but a voice in the wind. In many towns, villages, and even kingdoms, the surest form of protection wasn't the crown. It was kin. Family clans provided refuge. Cousins testified on your behalf. Uncles swore oaths for you. Brothers fought, if necessary, to keep you from being taken, fined, flogged, or worse. But only if you had the name. Only if you were written into the fabric of that family with a surname that bound you to them, legally and spiritually. Without a surname, you had no proof of belonging. And without proof of belonging, you had no one. You couldn't claim cousinship in court. You couldn't ask an uncle for asylum in his home without being accused of trespass. You couldn't even sit beside your kin during trial, because to the law, your relationship didn't exist, and that could mean death. In 1393, in a small town outside Durham, a young man named Owen, no last name, was accused of theft. The accuser was a traveling merchant. The only defense Owen had was his cousin Richard, a stonemason who swore the boy was with him at the time of the crime. But Richard had a surname. Owen didn't, and when questioned under oath, Richard could not prove their kinship. There was no charter, no birth record, no church log connecting them by blood, so the court dismissed the testimony. Owen was fined more than his family could pay, and when they couldn't pay, he was taken. This happened again and again. In Scotland, clans offered protection to bloodline kin and those they called sept, family branches, under their larger name. But if you came seeking shelter without a shared surname, without a known connection, you were turned away at the gates. You were not of them, and to say otherwise was to risk dishonoring the clan, even if your mother was a cousin, even if you bore the same nose, the same voice, the same fire. It didn't matter. Your name was your armor, and without it, you were naked in the eyes of every official, every noble, every priest. In border towns, where families often provided protection from raiders or foreign law, this lack of a surname meant being stranded. A child whose parents died in a fire could not simply claim the name of an aunt. A woman fleeing abuse could not shelter in her uncle's home without risking charges of deception. To be without a surname was to live on the outside of protection. You couldn't marry by claim of family bond. You couldn't inherit tools, fields, or titles. You couldn't even join a militia under a family banner because you had none. The law didn't see people. It saw names, and those names were weighted, recognized, connected to land, loyalty, and lineage. Without that weight, without that chain linking you backward in time, you were unanchored, rootless, and in times of crisis, danger, or false accusation, you had no fallback, no one to raise their voice when yours cracked, no one to step between you and the blow, no one to pull you from prison and say, "He is mine." Because to claim someone, you had to prove they were yours. And in the medieval world, the only proof that mattered was a name written down, not spoken, not remembered, written. So people clung to surnames not as vanity, but as survival. They carved them into lintels, burned them into chests, taught them to their children as gospel, because one missing name in a trial could mean exile. One absent record could mean hanging. One forgotten bloodline could leave you to face power alone. And in a world where power rarely listened, that was a sentence, not just to loneliness, but to disappearance. religious orders might rename you entirely. In the solemn candlelit halls of medieval monastery, seminaries, and convents, the moment you entered religious life, your pass was left at the door. Whatever name your mother whispered when you were born, whatever village you came from, whatever lineage once anchored you, was often stripped away the moment you donned the robe. You were no longer Thomas, son of Gregory the cobbler. You became Brother Augustine. You were no longer Elena of Windermere. You became Sister Scholastica. Religious orders across medieval Europe practiced a quiet but profound act of identity erasure, renaming. For those without formal surnames, and even for many who had them, entering a monastic life meant surrendering your secular identity completely. It was considered a spiritual rebirth, but for many, it also meant vanishing from the memory of the world that had once known them. The renaming wasn't just symbolic, it was enforced. Monks and nuns were frequently given names drawn from a close set of saints, martyrs, and biblical figures, or names tied to the monastery's patron, founding order, or geographic location. And once you took those names, your birth name was often never spoken again, not by the abbots, not by the scribes, not even by your fellow monks. For a peasant without a surname, this meant more than just being renamed. It meant being rewritten, your past replaced with a holy fiction that erased where you came from, who your parents were, what trade or sorrow or love had shaped you. This was considered virtuous. To the church, to let go of your earthly name was to let go of earthly attachments, to truly become of God. But in practice, it was a soft execution of personal identity. Take, for example, the case of a 15th century boy named Matteo, a shepherd's son from northern Italy. When he entered the Benedictine order at just 14, he was renamed Brother Benedetto, a common gesture of honor to Saint Benedict. His parish record was updated to reflect his new title, and all traces of Matteo vanished from monastery archives. His parents continued to refer to him by his birth name in letters, but these were stored under lock and key, read only by his superior. Matteo never saw them again. He died as Benedetto. His tomb bears only that name. And for women, the erasure was often even more complete. Young girls, some given to convents as children, were renamed not only to sever family ties, but to place them under the protection of a saint. The church believed this would purify them, strip them of vanity, and suppress their individuality. A girl named Laura, lively and curious, might become Sister Cecilia and live 40 years in cloistered silence, addressed only by that title. The emotional and psychological toll of this practice is lost in history's silence. Rarely do medieval chronicles record how it felt to lose a name, but clues remain in the rare private writings of monks who mourn their family, or in the marginalia of convent ledgers where a nun secretly scratched her birth name beside her saint's name, as if refusing to let it die. Some resisted. A few monks in Ireland and Wales managed to retain elements of their original names, blending them with Christian ones to hold on to some shred of identity. But this was rare. The more centralized and powerful the religious order, the more rigid the rules. In many Cistercian and Cluniac monasteries, for instance, strict naming conventions were enforced to avoid any trace of worldly attachment. You belong to God now, and God, they believed, had no need of your father's name. And yet, paradoxically, the church itself would record these new names in exquisite detail. Saints' names, monastery names, location tags like of Clairvaux or of Assisi. You became a monument to the order, not to yourself. And for the families left behind, this renaming could feel like a slow mourning. A son or daughter entered the order not just in body, but in name, soul, and voice. Parents might never again hear their child's true name spoken aloud in public. In some cases, noble families donated sons to monasteries, but expected their family name to be preserved in the clerical hierarchy. When it wasn't, bitterness followed. To lose a child to God was one thing, but to lose even the memory of their name, that was something deeper. So while stone abbeys and grand cathedrals rose in God's name, countless identities were buried beneath them, nameless or renamed, in the service of heaven. They gave their lives to the church, and in return, the church gave them new names. But it also took something that no one else could give back. Because in the medieval world, your name was your story, and for many, in cloistered silence, that story was rewritten in someone else's hand. You couldn't be taken seriously in petitions or appeals. You could suffer. You could bleed. You could lose your home, your child, your livelihood. But if you signed your name without a surname, your voice was tossed aside like a whisper in the wind. In the medieval world, power did not just belong to kings, lords, and clergy. It belonged to names, formal names, full names, recognized names. Without one, you weren't a person. You were a problem, an interruption, a noise. Petitions were one of the only tools the powerless had. A letter to a bishop pleading for justice, a message to a lord asking for protection, a formal appeal to a monarch begging for mercy. But if you signed it, John, son of no one, or Agnes the widow, the ink meant nothing. Because without a surname, without a lineage, a location, a property, you had no weight. You were assumed to be a liar, a beggar, or worse, a nobody. Clerks sorted petitions by importance, noble bloodlines on top, merchants next, tradesmen third, and at the very bottom, first names without status, crumpled, ignored, forgotten. Even if your plea was desperate, even if you told the truth, even if your life depended on being heard, you weren't. Records from the Royal Archives in 14th century England show hundreds of such discarded letters, signed with simple names, crude marks, or trembling X's. The complaints were real. My husband was taken by force. Our land was stolen by a reeve. My son was hanged for a crime he did not commit. But without a surname, there was no credibility, no weight, no response. It wasn't just bureaucracy, it was design. The system made it hard for the poor to be heard, on purpose. Nobles feared chaos, and the easiest way to control the masses was to ignore them. Let the faceless remain voiceless. And so they invented rules. Only appeals signed with a recognizable name, title, or seal would be read. If you didn't have those, you weren't taken seriously. Some tried to cheat the system. A few peasants forged names or paid scribes to write their petitions in polished Latin. But even then, if your name wasn't in the records, if it didn't match a tax roll, a land deed, or a church list, your words were treated as noise. Others attached tokens to their letters, a piece of cloth, a coin, a child's charm, to beg for sympathy. It rarely worked, because sympathy wasn't part of the process. Only legitimacy, and legitimacy required identity, and identity required a surname. This silence wasn't just legal, it was generational. If your grandfather was known only as Tom the Tanner, and your father died before being recorded, your name drifted further into oblivion. And when you wrote to the bishop, asking for justice after a neighbor took your livestock, they saw nothing but ink from the unknown. They didn't even need to read it. Your name told them everything they needed to know. And so the cycle continued. The powerful listened to the powerful. The named spoke to the named, and the nameless screamed into the void. Women suffered, especially. If a woman wrote alone without a husband's name attached, her petition was dismissed almost automatically. Her word was not considered valid on its own. She needed a man, a surname, a witness. Even queens ignored women who signed only as a widow, daughter, or Agnes of Nowhere, and so injustice flourished. Lands were stolen, children were punished, lives were ruined, all because the voices that cried out had no surnames. Today, we dig through archives, trying to piece together who these people were. We read the petitions that went unanswered. We find the letters, smudged and folded, written by trembling hands and delivered in hope. And we realize something brutal. They were real, they tried, they spoke, but they were not listened to. Not because they lacked truth, but because they lacked a name, and that, in their world, was the same as lacking a soul. You were barred from some town privileges or property rights. In the heart of medieval Europe, the difference between survival and suffering often came down to a single line in a town ledger, a surname. Not your skills, not your honesty, not your need, just your name, written down by someone who mattered, because in many towns across England, France, and the Low Countries, privileges like access to grazing land, water wells, market stalls, or even the right to store your tools safely were reserved only for those whose surnames appeared in the official rolls. And if your name wasn't there, you were nothing. No matter how long you'd lived in the village, no matter how many winters you'd endure beside the same crumbling stone walls, you could be barred from using the pasture, denied space in the communal shed, forbidden from drawing water from the guarded well during drought. Even if your animals starved, even if your children shivered with cold, even if you were born a stone's throw from the churchyard, none of it mattered, because you weren't registered, and without a surname, an official surname, inked into the town record, you were seen as transient, a shadow, a mouth with no lineage, a risk. Some called it the paper gate, a quiet wall of ink, an assumption. If you asked why you were being excluded, the answer was simple. You're not one of ours. Even if you worked their fields, even if your sweat had soaked into their soil, you were still seen as an outsider. And for the poorest, that wall was made of stone, because registering a name wasn't always free. In many towns, getting your family name entered into the town roll required payment, a small tax, a favor to the reeve, a signature from someone willing to vouch for you. If you had no money, no patron, no inheritance, you stayed outside the book, and outside the book meant outside the law. There are records from 1321 in a Flemish town showing a man named Odo, whose family had lived there for over 20 years, being denied access to the communal plough storage because his surname was never formally inscribed. When a fire swept through the village and destroyed his hut, he lost everything. The town council offered aid to registered residents. Odo got nothing, no wood, no grain, no shelter, because the book didn't know him. It didn't matter that the people did. Even marriage didn't guarantee entry. A woman might marry a registered man and gain access, but if her husband died and the name wasn't passed properly through church or town record, she could lose all rights, become, overnight, an unrecognized widow. And so, the nameless clung to the edges of society, living just beyond the border, sleeping near the markets, but not in them, feeding animals on scraps instead of grazing fields, hauling water from muddy ditches instead of wells. They were not rebels. They were not criminals. They were simply unacknowledged, ghosts in the records. And yet, they built the towns, carved the stones, cleaned the streets, lit the candles. But when it came time to share in what the community owned, they were told, This is not for you. This wasn't a written law in most places, but it was enforced all the same, because access wasn't about justice. It was about record keeping, about controlling who counted, who could inherit, who could belong. And it raises a chilling truth. You didn't need to be exiled to be excluded. Sometimes all it took was being left off the list. And if you tried to challenge it, you were met with silence, or worse, suspicion. Why weren't you registered? What are you hiding? Where's your father's name? Where's your proof? And if you couldn't answer, the door stayed closed. This wasn't the loud brutality of war or plague. It was the quiet violence of erasure, of not being seen, of living your whole life beside people who smiled at you but never opened the gate. And today, we rarely think of surnames as shields, but in the medieval world, they were keys. Keys to land, to safety, to warmth. And for those without them, the lock never turned. You might be drafted into military service as a stand-in for a noble servant. In the medieval world, war wasn't just a clash of kings. It was a harvest of bodies. And when the summons came, when banners were raised, horns were blown, and levies were called, it wasn't always the noble servant or listed soldier who marched to battle. Sometimes it was you, a man with no last name, no formal identity, no protection, just a first name, a village, and the misfortune of being convenient. Because in the cruel calculus of feudal warfare, the voiceless were the most expendable. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, when lords were commanded by monarchs to provide men for military campaigns, whether for foreign conquests, crusades, or territorial skirmishes, they had a legal obligation to send able-bodied males from their estates. Usually, these came from a pool of named servants, bonded laborers, or even paid retainers. But there was a trick, a dangerous and devastating loophole. If one of those named men was too valuable, too favored, or simply unwilling to go, the Lord could send a replacement. And if you were landless, unnamed, or new to the village, your identity was loose enough to mold into anything the Lord needed it to be. You became the stand-in, not a soldier, a shadow. It worked like this. Say a noble had a servant named Thomas, listed in his rolls, who had been called to serve in the king's army, but Thomas managed the estate's wine cellar, or was the Lord's bastard half-brother, or simply had influence. The Lord didn't want to lose him, so he looked across his estate for another Thomas, one with no surname, no family clout, no recorded obligations, and he made the switch. In the ledgers, it still said Thomas. The duty was fulfilled. The crown didn't ask questions. And you? You were given a weapon you'd never held, told to swear fealty to a banner you didn't recognize, and marched off with a group of strangers into a war you didn't choose. Some men tried to resist. They claimed they weren't that Thomas, or that William, or that Hugh, but without a surname, without a land title, without clerical records or witnesses, they had no defense, no legal ground to stand on. The court simply said, "You match the name. That is enough." One recorded case from 1311 in Sussex tells of a man named John, just John, who was taken to serve in place of a steward's cousin. He protested, said he had a limp, that he wasn't even on the rolls, but the steward claimed he was John of the estate, and that was sufficient. John was last seen marching south with the levy. He never returned. These weren't isolated events. In England, France, the Italian city-states, and the Holy Roman Empire, stand-in conscription became a whispered strategy of the elite. Lords would shuffle names, forge substitutions, trade peasants between estates like game pieces, and the law turned a blind eye. Because the quota was met, And who cared which John went, as long as someone died for the flag? It wasn't just men. Boys as young as 14 were drafted out under assumed identities. They'd be plucked from field work, handed spears, and pushed to the front lines. Some were told it was an honor. Others were given no explanation at all. Just a name, a pack, and a push. And it wasn't always for battle. Some were forced to serve as supply haulers, camp servants, or human shields. Others were sent on dangerous scouting missions because, as one noble reportedly said, "Better he be lost than one I named." The logic was brutal, the outcome worse. What made this worse still was the erasure that followed. If you died in war under a name that wasn't yours, your family had no way to claim your body, no way to argue your case. The record said Thomas. They had no way to prove you weren't him. So your grave, if there was one, bore a name that wasn't yours. Your death was a clerical trick, a falsified duty paid in real blood. Some tried to fight back through the church. Monasteries occasionally offered sanctuary to men wrongly drafted. A few friars wrote letters protesting the deception, but such pleas were rarely heard above the clamor of swords and the politics. And if you resisted too loudly, you were branded a deserter, a crime punishable by death. So most accepted their fate. They took on the false name, walked into the ranks, learned to hold a pike or light a torch. Some survived and returned, wearing scars for sins that weren't theirs. Others never came home, buried under banners they never swore to defend. Their mothers wept for sons who were never meant to serve. Their children bore names from graves that weren't their own. And centuries later, historians still puzzle over strange patterns in military roles. Repeated names, sudden substitutions, untraceable soldiers. They search for the real identities behind the ink. But most are lost, vanished into the fog of a war that needed bodies, not truth. Because in the medieval world, a noble servant might be spared, but you, with no last name, no title, and no power, you were the perfect sacrifice. Your marriage could be denied by the church without proof of origin. In the medieval world, love was never enough, not for the church, not when it came to marriage. You could stand before the altar, hands trembling, heart certain. You could know her since childhood, work beside him in the fields, promise loyalty before God. But if you had no surname, no traceable family line, your wedding could be denied, not for lack of devotion, not for lack of faith, but for fear of confusion. The church called it proximity of blood, a doctrine rooted in canon law, born from deep fears of accidental incest, hereditary sin, and the collapse of social order, because in small villages, where bloodlines wove tightly and names were few, the church needed to be sure, absolutely sure, that the two people standing before the altar were not kin. And how did they confirm that? Through records, names, lineage, written proof. If you didn't have it, the priest could stop the ceremony on the spot. No parchment, no blessing. Even if the whole village swore you weren't related, even if your family had lived on opposite ends of the shire for generations, if your name wasn't recorded in the right place, if it wasn't traceable, you weren't permitted to marry. Because what if you shared a grandmother and didn't know? What if your great-uncle had a child out of wedlock and that child's name was never written? The church feared sin by accident more than injustice by design, and so couples were turned away, not in rage, but in cold, quiet rejection. In Norwich, in 1407, a young couple was denied marriage because neither could produce a surname that matched church registry. They begged, their families testified, but the priest refused. The church feared scandal, feared that blessing this union might bring disgrace later. In Bruges, in 1392, a merchant's daughter and a stable boy had their wedding halted mid-ceremony after a bishop's aide questioned the boy's lineage. His mother had no surname. His father was unknown. That was enough to cast the entire match into suspicion. And just like that, love became invalid. No crime committed, no vows broken, just the absence of written heritage. This wasn't rare. It was structure. Canon law required a dispensation, a formal approval, if there was any ambiguity of bloodline. And ambiguity was inevitable when the poor were denied the right to record their names. Peasants weren't taught to write. They weren't granted official birth documents. Their identities were oral, alive in memory, in story, in community. But the memory wasn't enough. Not for the church. Not when the soul of marriage was considered a sacred contract with eternal consequences. So couples forged names, invented surnames, carved false bloodlines into Bibles just to stand a chance. Some fled to other villages where no one asked questions. Others lived together in quiet shame, labeled sinful for the crime of undocumented love. And what did this do to a society? It turned the weddings into investigations, turned priests into judges, turned family trees into walls. And the result? The poor were punished twice, first by poverty, then by silence, because they had no names, and thus no way to marry with honor. It wasn't about God, it was about the paperwork. If you were noble, dispensations could be purchased. If you were wealthy, records were kept. But for the poor, the record was dust. Their names were spoken at graves, not in scrolls, so love became conditional, not on truth, but on traceability. And when the church said no, it didn't just deny a wedding, it denied legitimacy. Children born without a Tolkien's church-sanctioned union were labeled illegitimate, excluded from inheritance, from guild apprenticeships, even from burial in holy ground, all because two people couldn't prove they were strangers in blood. And so, in the most sacred moment, at the altar, before God, your fate didn't rest in your heart. It rested in a name, written, witnessed, approved, or denied. Your children might inherit a humiliating or made-up name. In the dim, drafty chambers of medieval parish offices, scribes hunched over parchment, quills scratching names into existence. These were not always the names of nobility, of known lineages, or recorded bloodlines. Often they were the names of the nameless, the peasants, the wanderers, the children of nobody. And in those inked lines, the seeds of countless modern surnames were planted. But many of those names began not with honor. They began with mockery, guesses, or bureaucratic shortcuts. If you lived in the 13th or 14th century and lacked a clear surname, as most villagers did, you didn't get to choose one. The priest, the local bailiff, or the town scribe often did it for you. And the names they chose? They could be cold, crude, even humiliating. Your child might be called Hogget, a diminutive form of hog, given perhaps because their father worked with pigs, or because of a ruddy face and wide nose. That name would then pass to the child's children and grandchildren, until one day it appeared on legal documents, in church rolls, even on stone. A girl born during Christmas might be labeled Noel, not because it honored her spirit, but because the scribe had no other way to distinguish her from the 6 other Agneses in the village. If her family lacked a surname, a season, a feast day, or a misheard phrase could become a family's identity for generations. Or perhaps your ancestor walked with a limp, or had a twisted ankle. That might become Crookshanks, a name that began as a crude description, recorded without consent, and destined to outlive the body it described. These weren't exceptions. They were common. Surnames like Short, Longstaff, Little, Hubble, Bogus, and Snell all emerged from this messy patchwork of clerical creativity, where officials filled in the blanks of a family's identity based on whatever they saw, heard, or assumed. The names could reflect birthplace, Atwood, Bywater, Hill, or trades, Fletcher, Cooper, Smith. But if you had no land, no trade, and no reputation, that's when things turned strange. In some cases, the name came from a curse or joke. One surviving court document from 1377 refers to a man named Thomas Lackpenny, almost certainly a poor man whose name had been twisted into a public label. Another record lists Alice Knott, a woman of likely low status, possibly labeled for reasons no one dared write down. For those born out of wedlock, names could be crueler still. While some churches took pity and named such children after saints or feast days, others labeled them with names like Bastu from bastard, or Hitch, a shortened form of hatchling or foundling. In areas where illegitimacy was scorned, entire family lines were marked with names that began as punishments, and once recorded, there was no undoing them. Your name, however it began, was passed to your children and theirs. In a world where literacy was rare and the church controlled identity, these names became not just labels, but chains. A single moment of mockery, a lazy guess by a priest, or an offhand insult by a land registrar could shape the fate of an entire family line, and sometimes the names outlived their meanings. Pennyfather, Swindle, Grub, Drinkwater, Mathern, Quail. What once began as jokes, physical features, habits, or insults are now harmless surnames that pass through school rosters and tax forms unnoticed. But centuries ago, those names were not neutral. They were scars written in ink. Even noble-sounding names could carry forgotten humiliation. The name Noel, so often romanticized today, began not as a family's proud crest, but as a convenient label for a nameless child born during a liturgical holiday. It said nothing about who they were, only when, and yet in that arbitrary name a family tree began. This was the great paradox of medieval naming. The chaos of scribes and customs created order, but that order was often born from accident, mockery, or shame. So when you see a strange surname, or carry one yourself that seems oddly specific or oddly cruel, remember, it might be the legacy of a winter's day, a crooked ankle, a lost parent, or a hungry clerk in a dim room, desperate to finish his ledger before sunset. You didn't choose your name, but someone once did, and they may not have cared who you were, only that they had to write something. You had to earn a name through deed, not birth. You weren't born with a name, not the kind that lasted, not the kind that meant anything. In the medieval world, names weren't inherited unless you were noble. For everyone else, you had to earn your name through action, through reputation, through something unforgettable, something loud enough that people couldn't ignore it. Sometimes it was glory. A soldier who split a man in two with a single blow might become Richard Strongarm. A stonemason who built a chapel alone was remembered as Thomas Stonecutter. A hunter who brought down wolves with his bare hands might be William Wolfslayer. But those were rare, extraordinary, the kind of name spoken with awe. Most people didn't get that kind of name. Most people were known only by what they did, or what was wrong with them. John the Dung Carrier, Alice Crookedfoot, Martin Halfwit. Not because they chose it, not because it was true, but because it stuck. And in villages where everyone knew each other, the label became the law. Once it was said, it became your name. And once it became your name, it became your fate. If you were born poor, nameless, and ordinary, you were referred to by your labor. Miller, baker, shepherd, not as an honor, but as a limit, a cage. You weren't a person, you were a function, a tool, and if you left your village and started again, it followed you, because your job traveled with you, and if your job didn't, your flaw did. You might try to escape it, but in a world without documents, your name was your rumor. That's how identity worked, through whispers, through repetition, through the mouth of someone louder than you. And once a clerk, a priest, or a landlord wrote it down, it was sealed. A child born to Emma No Tooth might become John Emma's boy, or worse, John the Toothless, even if he had all his teeth. Shame passed faster than honor. Deeds made names, but not just heroic deeds. Mistakes did too. One drunken outburst, one fall from a ladder, one lost gamble in front of the wrong person, and that moment could brand you for life. No trial, no correction, just a name. And for most people, there was no climbing out. There were no family crests, no parchment trees stretching back to noble blood. If your grandfather was a cobbler, you were too. If your father was William Greedy, people assumed you would be just as cruel. No one waited for proof. Your name spoke before you did. And even if you lived with dignity, worked with pride, prayed with faith, it didn't matter if no one noticed. You had to do something big to change your name, and most people weren't given the chance, so their name stayed small, or worse, cruel.